The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns and parked cars. The streets were calm, with only a few vehicles passing by. Margaret Thompson, an elderly black woman in her late 70s, was driving home after spending the afternoon visiting friends. Her car moved slowly as she approached a four-way stop sign. She came to a near halt before rolling through it, a minor mistake that many drivers might make without a second thought. Unbeknownst to Margaret, Officer Daniel Hayes had been sitting in his patrol car just around the corner, monitoring traffic. His shift had been uneventful so far, and he was eager to find something, or someone, to justify his presence on the road. When he noticed Margaret's car, his eyes narrowed behind his sunglasses. He flipped on the flashing lights and pulled out to follow her. To him, this wasn't just another routine stop. It was an opportunity to assert control. Margaret glanced in her rearview mirror and sighed softly when she saw the police car behind her. She knew she'd made a small error at the stop sign, but didn't think much of it. After all, she had lived in this town for decades and never once encountered trouble with the law. Pulling over gently, she rolled down her window and waited patiently, expecting a polite conversation about her minor infraction. But what happened next shocked her and set the stage for an unforgettable encounter. As soon as Officer Hayes stepped out of his vehicle, his body language screamed authority and aggression. His jaw was clenched, and his hand rested firmly on his belt, close to his handcuffs. Without so much as a greeting, he barked, "License and registration." His tone was sharp, dismissive, and laced with hostility. Margaret blinked, taken aback by his demeanor. She reached into her purse slowly, careful not to alarm him, and handed over her documents. Instead of reviewing them right away, Hayes leaned into the open window, glaring at her. His voice grew louder as he lectured her about following traffic rules. "You people need to learn how to drive properly," he snapped, his words dripping with condescension. Margaret felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't the first time she'd faced such treatment, but it stung every time. Still, she kept her composure, refusing to let his rudeness rattle her. She nodded politely and said, "Officer, I understand your concern, but I believe I came to a complete stop." Her calm response seemed to irritate Hayes even more. He crossed his arms and raised his voice further, accusing her of being disrespectful and evasive. Passers-by began to slow down, curious about the commotion. Some even pulled out their phones to record the scene, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Yet Hayes remained oblivious, too caught up in his own sense of superiority to notice the growing audience or consider why his behavior might seem excessive. What started as a simple traffic stop had quickly spiraled into something far more intense. For Margaret, it was a painful reminder of the biases she had faced throughout her life. But little did Hayes know, he was about to meet someone who wouldn't back down, not because she was defiant, but because she carried a lifetime of wisdom and resilience. And soon, those qualities would leave him speechless. Margaret Thompson wasn't just any elderly woman. Beneath her calm exterior lay a lifetime of experiences that had shaped her into the strong, dignified person she was today. Born in the 1940s in a small southern town, she grew up during a time when segregation ruled every aspect of life. Separate water fountains, separate schools, and separate seating on buses were not just rules. They were a way of life. But even as a child, Margaret had a quiet fire inside her. She watched her parents endure discrimination with grace and determination, teaching her that strength didn't always mean shouting. Sometimes, it meant standing firm without losing your composure. As a young woman, Margaret became deeply involved in the civil rights movement. She attended marches, joined sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, and stood shoulder to shoulder with others who believed in equality. She remembered the fear of being sprayed with hoses and chased by dogs during protests, but also the hope that filled her heart when people united for justice. Those years taught her resilience and gave her an unshakable belief in the power of peace and patience. Even now, decades later, those lessons stayed with her. After earning her degree, Margaret dedicated her career to education, becoming a beloved schoolteacher. For over 30 years, she inspired generations of students, many of whom came from underprivileged backgrounds. Her classroom was more than a place to learn math or history. It was a safe space where children felt valued and heard. Margaret often shared stories of the civil rights movement with her students, reminding them of how far society had come while acknowledging there was still work to be done. Many of her former students stayed in touch, crediting her with helping them navigate challenges in their own lives. But perhaps what made Margaret truly remarkable was her family legacy. Her son, Marcus Thompson, had followed in her footsteps, though his path took him in a different direction. Marcus joined the police force out of a desire to create change from within, a decision Margaret fully supported. Over the years, he rose through the ranks, eventually becoming chief of police in a nearby city. Known for his integrity and commitment to reform, Marcus worked tirelessly to bridge the gap between law enforcement and marginalized communities. He often said his mother's teachings guided everything he did. Now, sitting in her car as Officer Hayes berated her, Margaret drew strength from these memories. She thought about the battles she'd fought, both big and small, and the progress she'd witnessed over the decades. She thought about her son and the values they shared. This moment, as unsettling as it was, wouldn't break her. If anything, it reminded her why the fight for respect and fairness mattered so much. Still, the irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a woman who had spent her entire life advocating for justice, being treated like a criminal for something as minor as rolling through a stop sign. The injustice burned, but Margaret refused to let it consume her. Instead, she focused on staying calm. Deep down, she knew this encounter wouldn't end here. Something told her that Officer Hayes was about to learn a lesson he wouldn't soon forget, and maybe, just maybe, it would make him think twice before treating someone else this way. Officer Daniel Hayes was not used to being questioned. In his mind, authority meant obedience, no questions asked. So when Margaret calmly responded to his accusations with a simple, "Officer, I understand your concern, but I believe I came to a complete stop," it felt like a direct challenge to his power. His face reddened, and his voice grew louder as he leaned closer to her car window. "Don't try to play games with me," he snapped, his tone sharp and dismissive. "You know exactly what you did wrong." Margaret didn't flinch. She kept her hands resting gently on the steering wheel, her posture relaxed yet assertive. Her calmness only seemed to infuriate Hayes more. He began pacing back and forth beside her car, gesturing wildly as he lectured her about traffic laws and responsibility. Every word dripped with condescension, as if he were speaking to someone incapable of understanding basic instructions. To him, this wasn't just about a minor traffic violation. It was about control. And Margaret's quiet composure threatened that control. By now, several cars had slowed down to watch the scene unfold. Some drivers honked their horns impatiently, eager to get moving, while others pulled out their phones to record the interaction. The flashing lights of Hayes' patrol car illuminated the growing crowd, drawing even more attention. A young mother in a minivan rolled down her window and called out, "Is everything okay here?" Her voice carried a mix of concern and suspicion. Hayes shot her a glare, warning her to mind her own business without saying a word. But Margaret remained unfazed. She listened to Hayes' tirade with the same patience she'd shown earlier, her expression unchanged. Inside, however, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. This wasn't the first time she'd faced such treatment, but it never got easier. She thought about her students, her son, and all the work they had done to build trust between communities and law enforcement. How could someone like Hayes undo years of progress with his reckless behavior? Hayes, meanwhile, was too caught up in his own frustration to notice the ripple effect of his actions. His chest puffed out as he continued berating Margaret, pointing at her car and raising his voice even higher. "Do you have any idea how dangerous it is to ignore traffic rules?" He barked, as if she were some reckless teenager instead of a careful, experienced driver. He made sweeping generalizations about people like you, needing to take responsibility for their actions, oblivious to how offensive his words sounded. The longer he went on, the more absurd the situation became. Margaret's quiet dignity stood in stark contrast to Hayes' escalating aggression. Passers-by exchanged glances, shaking their heads or whispering among themselves. One man muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "This is ridiculous. She hasn't done anything wrong." Another chimed in, "He's treating her like a criminal over nothing." Still, Hayes pressed on, convinced that his badge gave him the upper hand. What he didn't realize was that every harsh word, every accusatory gesture, only dug him deeper into a hole of his own making. Margaret hadn't raised her voice once, yet she exuded a quiet strength that unsettled him. It was clear he was losing control of the situation, though he refused to admit it. As the tension reached its peak, Hayes leaned in one last time, his face inches from Margaret's. "Are you even listening to me?" he demanded, his voice trembling with anger. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, with unwavering calm, Margaret looked him straight in the eye and spoke 5 words that would leave him frozen in place. The air seemed to still as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The moment hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Officer Daniel Hayes, red-faced and seething, leaned into Margaret's car window, his voice booming as he demanded her attention. But instead of cowering or lashing back, Margaret simply looked at him with steady eyes. There was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet confidence that seemed to pierce through his bluster. Then, in a calm and measured tone, she asked the question that would change everything. "Do you know who my son is?" For a split second, Hayes froze. His mouth stayed slightly open, mid-rant, as if someone had pressed pause on his tirade. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, jolting him out of his self-righteous fury. He blinked rapidly, his mind racing to process what she just said. Who was her son? And why did she sound so sure it mattered? Margaret didn't wait for him to recover. She continued speaking, her voice firm but not unkind. "My son is Chief Marcus Thompson." The name landed like a thunderclap. Hayes staggered backward, nearly tripping over his own feet as the weight of her words sank in. Chief Marcus Thompson, the same man whose leadership workshops he'd attended, the same man whose speeches about reforming policing practices had been shared widely across departments, the same man who had earned respect from both officers and civilians alike. Hayes felt his stomach drop. All the bravado drained from his face as realization dawned on him. This wasn't just some ordinary citizen he was yelling at. It was the mother of one of the most respected figures in law enforcement, a man known for holding his officers accountable and pushing for fairness and integrity within the force. Suddenly, every harsh word Hayes had spat, every condescending remark, came rushing back to haunt him. He realized too late that he might have crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The crowd watching nearby seemed to sense the shift in energy. Phones were still recording, capturing Hayes' stunned expression as he stumbled to regain his composure. Whispers rippled through the gathering spectators. "Did she say Chief Thompson?" One person murmured. Another nodded knowingly, their camera aimed squarely at the officer now fumbling for words. Even the young mother in the minivan raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the unexpected twist. Margaret sat quietly in her car, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She watched Hayes with a look that was neither triumphant nor vengeful, just steady and resolute. It was as though she already knew how this moment would play out. For her, this wasn't about gloating or humiliating him. It was about making him see the error of his ways. Her identity wasn't a weapon to wield recklessly. It was a reminder of the values she and her son stood for. But Hayes wasn't thinking about values or principles right now. His mind was spinning, trying to calculate the damage he'd done. Would Chief Thompson hear about this? Would there be consequences for his behavior today? Every second that passed felt heavier than the last. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, unsure of what to say. For the first time in his career, he felt completely powerless. As the silence stretched on, Margaret finally broke it. "Officer," she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I hope this can be a learning experience for both of us." Her words weren't accusatory. They carried a gentle authority that only deepened Hayes' shame. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he struggled to find a response. But before he could muster anything coherent, Margaret reached for her purse and handed him her license and registration once more, as if signaling that the matter was settled for now. The crowd began to disperse slowly, their murmurs fading into the evening air. But Hayes remained rooted to the spot, his confidence shattered. Little did he know, this encounter was far from over. The video footage captured by bystanders would soon spread like wildfire, forcing him, and the entire department, to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and accountability. And Margaret? She drove away calmly, knowing full well that her 5 simple words had sparked something much bigger than either of them could have anticipated. By the time Margaret pulled away from the curb, the video of her encounter with Officer Daniel Hayes had already begun to circulate online. Bystanders who had recorded the incident uploaded their footage to social media, where it quickly gained traction. The clip showed everything: Hayes' aggressive tone, his dismissive body language, and the stark contrast between his behavior and Margaret's calm dignity. But what truly captured people's attention were her 5 simple words: "Do you know who my son is?" And the immediate shift in Hayes' demeanor afterward. Within hours, the video went viral, sparking outrage and debate across platforms. Chief Marcus Thompson was one of the first to see it. A colleague forwarded him the link late that evening, along with a note saying, "You need to watch this." At first, Marcus thought it was just another example of police misconduct, an issue he worked tirelessly to address in his department. But as he watched the video, his heart sank. The woman in the car wasn't just any citizen. It was his mother. His mother, being screamed at by an officer half her age, treated like a criminal over something as minor as rolling through a stop sign. Marcus felt a mix of emotions: anger, frustration, and a deep sense of protectiveness. He replayed the video several times, focusing on the way Hayes spoke to her, the disrespect in his tone, the unnecessary escalation. It all pointed to something deeper than a bad day or a single mistake. This was bias, plain and simple. And as much as Marcus wanted to march into the precinct right then and demand answers, he knew better. As chief, he had to handle this professionally, even if every fiber of his being urged him to act impulsively. The next morning, Marcus issued a public statement condemning the officer's actions. "What happened yesterday is unacceptable," he wrote. "No one, regardless of age, race, or background, should ever be treated with such lack of respect, especially by someone sworn to serve and protect." He went on to acknowledge his personal connection to the incident, but emphasized that his response wasn't about family ties. It was about accountability. "This isn't just about my mother," he said during a press conference later that day. "It's about ensuring that everyone feels safe and respected when interacting with law enforcement." Meanwhile, Hayes found himself at the center of a media firestorm. His colleagues avoided eye contact in the hallways, and whispers followed him wherever he went. Some defended him, claiming he was simply doing his job, while others openly criticized his conduct. Internal Affairs launched an investigation, reviewing the video frame by frame to assess whether protocol had been violated. Hayes sat through countless meetings, his face pale and his hands trembling as he tried to explain himself. He apologized profusely, insisting he hadn't meant to cause harm, but his excuses rang hollow to those who had seen the video. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read "Respect our elders" and "Justice for Margaret Thompson." Community leaders called for sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training and stricter oversight of officer conduct. Even local politicians weighed in, using the incident as an example of why systemic change was necessary. For Margaret, the attention was overwhelming but not entirely surprising. She had lived long enough to understand how moments like these could shine a light on larger issues. When reporters reached out to her for comment, she declined most interviews, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves. However, she did agree to release a brief statement. "I do not wish to see this officer lose his career over one mistake," she said, "but I hope this serves as a reminder that we must treat each other with kindness and fairness, regardless of our differences." Her words struck a chord with many, offering a counterpoint to the calls for punishment. Forgiveness wasn't always easy, but Margaret believed it was essential for healing. Still, forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. The incident had exposed cracks in the system that couldn't be ignored, and Marcus, along with other advocates, vowed to ensure real change came from it. As the dust began to settle, Hayes faced a reckoning. Suspended pending investigation, he spent sleepless nights replaying the encounter in his mind. What started as a routine traffic stop had spiraled into a national conversation about racism, authority, and accountability. For better or worse, his life, and the lives of countless others, would never be the same again. The fallout from the incident spread like wildfire, igniting conversations far beyond the small suburban town where it had occurred. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForMargaret and #AccountabilityInAction, while news outlets dissected every detail of the confrontation. Margaret's composed response to Officer Daniel Hayes' aggression became a symbol of resilience, sparking admiration across the country. Meanwhile, Hayes found himself at the center of an intense spotlight, one that grew harsher with each passing day. Internally, the police department scrambled to address the situation. Chief Marcus Thompson took charge of the investigation personally, determined to ensure transparency and fairness. He called an emergency meeting with his leadership team, stressing the importance of accountability. "This isn't just about one officer," he told them firmly. "It's about how we as a department respond when trust is broken." Training sessions on implicit bias and de-escalation tactics were announced immediately, though some officers grumbled privately about being forced into sensitivity training. To Marcus, these complaints only underscored the need for change. Hayes, meanwhile, was suspended without pay pending the outcome of the disciplinary hearing. Each morning, he woke up dreading what awaited him. The mounting criticism online, the sideways glances from colleagues who once joked around with him, and the gnawing guilt that refused to fade. He replayed the video repeatedly, cringing at his own behavior. At first, he tried to justify his actions, telling himself that he'd been following procedure. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the truth. He had let his biases cloud his judgment, turning a minor traffic stop into a public spectacle. During the hearing, Hayes apologized profusely, addressing both the review board and Margaret directly. "I deeply regret my conduct," he said, his voice trembling. "I allowed frustration and assumptions to guide my actions instead of professionalism and respect. I failed not only Mrs. Thompson but also the badge I swore to uphold." His apology sounded sincere, yet it came too late to undo the damage. The board deliberated for hours before deciding on a suspension extension and mandatory participation in bias training programs. For many, this punishment felt insufficient, but others argued it was a step toward rehabilitation rather than retribution. Margaret, however, chose forgiveness over bitterness. When asked during a brief interview if she harbored resentment toward Hayes, she shook her head gently. "We all make mistakes," she said. "What matters is what we learn from them." I hope this experience helps him, and others, understand the impact of their words and actions. Her grace under pressure earned widespread praise, further solidifying her role as a beacon of wisdom and compassion. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. The community rallied together, organizing forums and discussions about systemic racism and policing practices. Local activists partnered with Marcus to push for policy changes, including stricter guidelines for traffic stops and increased oversight of officer behavior. Margaret attended several of these events, quietly supporting the efforts while letting younger voices take the lead. As weeks turned into months, Hayes struggled to rebuild his reputation. Some fellow officers distanced themselves from him, embarrassed by association, while others offered cautious support. Despite completing the required training, he remained haunted by the knowledge that his actions had harmed someone as kind and respected as Margaret. In quieter moments, he wondered if he deserved a second chance, or if the badge he cherished so much should belong to someone else. While Hayes wrestled with his conscience, Margaret continued living her life with quiet purpose. She visited schools, spoke at community gatherings, and reminded everyone she met that progress often started with uncomfortable truths. Her story wasn't just about holding someone accountable, it was about inspiring people to reflect, grow, and work toward a better future. And though the road ahead would be long, seeds of change had already been planted, thanks in part to 5 simple words spoken by a woman unafraid to stand firm in the face of injustice. Months after the incident, the town was still buzzing with discussions about what had happened. The viral video of Margaret Thompson's encounter with Officer Daniel Hayes continued to serve as a catalyst for change, sparking debates in living rooms, classrooms, and city council meetings. While some people argued that Hayes' behavior was an isolated case of poor judgment, others insisted it was symptomatic of deeper issues within law enforcement. Either way, one thing was clear: the community wasn't going to let the moment pass without action. The police department rolled out new initiatives aimed at addressing bias and improving public trust. Training sessions became mandatory for all officers, focusing not just on technical skills, but also on empathy, cultural awareness, and de-escalation techniques. Chief Marcus Thompson personally oversaw these programs, bringing in experts and activists to lead workshops. Change starts from within, he told his team during one session. If we want the public to see us as allies, we have to earn that trust every single day. But while many officers embraced the reforms, others resisted. Some grumbled about political correctness taking over their jobs, claiming the training felt like an attack on their integrity. Behind closed doors, they questioned whether incidents like the one involving Margaret were really worth so much attention. Hayes, now back on duty after completing his suspension and training, found himself caught between 2 worlds. On the surface, he appeared committed to doing better, attending every workshop and nodding along dutifully. But privately, he wrestled with resentment, feeling as though he'd been unfairly singled out. He hadn't intended to harm anyone, yet his reputation was tarnished, and he couldn't shake the feeling that no amount of training could erase the public's perception of him. Margaret, meanwhile, remained steadfast in her mission to foster understanding. She began attending community forums, sharing her story not to shame anyone, but to highlight the importance of accountability and compassion. At one such event, held in a packed auditorium, she stood at the podium and spoke softly but powerfully. "I've lived long enough to know that progress isn't easy," she said. "It requires humility. From individuals and institutions alike, we must learn to listen to each other, even when it's uncomfortable." Her words resonated deeply with those in attendance. Many nodded in agreement, while others wiped away tears. A young man in the front row raised his hand and asked, "What can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again?" Margaret smiled warmly before responding. "Speak up," she said simply. "When you see injustice, don't stay silent. Use your voice, your vote, and your actions to demand better." Change begins with ordinary people deciding they won't accept anything less than fairness. For Hayes, sitting quietly in the back of the room, Margaret's message hit hard. Hearing her speak so kindly after everything he'd put her through left him feeling both humbled and conflicted. Part of him wanted to approach her afterward, to thank her for her grace and apologize once more. But fear held him back, the fear of rejection, of being reminded of his mistakes. Instead, he slipped out unnoticed, his mind racing with thoughts of how far he still had to go. Despite the challenges, the ripple effects of Margaret's courage continued to spread. Local schools incorporated lessons about systemic bias into their curriculums, inspired by her example. Community leaders formed coalitions to monitor police activity and advocate for transparency. Even the mayor announced plans to establish a citizen review board to oversee law enforcement practices, a move hailed as a victory for advocates of reform. Yet Margaret never sought recognition or praise. To her, this was simply another chapter in the lifelong fight for justice. As she walked home from the forum that evening, bundled against the crisp autumn air, she reflected on the journey ahead. Progress would take time, patience, and persistence, but she believed in the goodness of people, in their capacity to grow and change. And sometimes, she thought with a small smile, all it took was 5 simple words to remind someone of what truly mattered. Months turned into a year, and the town began to feel different, subtly, but undeniably. The reforms implemented by Chief Marcus Thompson started to take root, reshaping how officers interacted with the community. Traffic stops became less confrontational, neighborhood patrols more collaborative. Officers were encouraged to attend local events, not as enforcers but as neighbors. Slowly, trust began to rebuild, brick by brick. Margaret Thompson became a beloved figure in this new chapter of change. Her name was often mentioned at town hall meetings and community forums, not just because of what had happened to her, but because of how she had responded, with grace, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to progress. People admired her ability to turn a painful moment into an opportunity for growth. She didn't seek the spotlight, but it found her anyway. One evening, Margaret received an invitation to speak at a statewide conference on police reform. The event brought together law enforcement leaders, activists, educators, and citizens from across the region, all united by a shared goal: creating safer, fairer communities. When her turn came to address the crowd, she walked onto the stage wearing a warm smile and holding a small notebook filled with handwritten notes. Dressed modestly in a navy blue dress, she looked every bit the kind grandmother she was. But when she spoke, her words carried the weight of decades of experience. "I've lived through times when speaking up meant risking everything," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I've seen hatred divide us and love bring us back together. And I've learned that real change doesn't come from anger or punishment. It comes from understanding." Pausing for a moment, she scanned the audience, making eye contact with those seated closest to the stage. "What happened to me last year wasn't unique. It happens every day, in ways big and small, to people who look like me, talk like me, or simply don't fit someone else's idea of normal. But instead of letting bitterness consume me, I chose forgiveness, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary." Her speech continued, weaving personal stories with calls to action. She reminded everyone that lasting change required effort from both sides, accountability from those in power and patience from those demanding justice. "We're all human," she said. "We all make mistakes. What matters is whether we're willing to learn from them, and whether we're brave enough to admit when we're wrong." The room erupted in applause when she finished, the sound echoing off the walls. Many attendees lingered afterward, eager to shake her hand or share their own experiences. One young officer approached her hesitantly, his cap tucked under his arm. "Miss Thompson," he said quietly, "thank you for reminding us why we do this job, for people like you." Margaret smiled and patted his shoulder. "Keep listening," she told him. "That's all anyone can ask." Back home, life returned to its quiet rhythm for Margaret. She tended to her garden, visited friends, and spent time with her grandchildren, sharing stories of resilience and hope. Yet her legacy continued to grow beyond her front porch. Schools named scholarships after her, murmurings of a street renaming circulated, and students studying civil rights wrote essays about her courage. Through it all, Margaret stayed humble, deflecting praise with a laugh and a wave of her hand. "It's not about me," she'd say. "It's about what we can achieve together." As for Officer Daniel Hayes, his journey remained complicated. Though he completed his training and returned to duty, he struggled to regain the respect of his peers and the public. Some dismissed him entirely, while others saw glimpses of genuine effort. He eventually transferred to a smaller precinct, hoping for a fresh start. Whether he truly changed or simply adapted remained unclear, even to himself. But one thing was certain: Margaret's words stayed with him, a quiet reminder of the humanity behind every badge and every citizen. In the end, Margaret's story wasn't just about calling out injustice. It was about inspiring others to be better. It proved that even in moments of tension and fear, there was space for dignity, forgiveness, and transformation. And as long as people remembered her message, the fight for fairness would continue, carried forward by ordinary individuals determined to leave the world kinder than they found it.